In the last session, we looked at the commissioning of the 12, continuing the mission of Jesus, and the opposition that continued to come from the scribes who claimed that Jesus was able to do the things that he did because he was in collusion with Beelzebul, the prince of devils. This opposition also spread to a group closer to Jesus, in this section, namely his family, who claimed that he was out of his mind. We looked at Jesus' answer to both of these objections. And finally, we examined the literary form of parable and saw how it was used by Jesus in the parables of the sower and the seed growing secretly and the mustard seed. In the current session, we will look at the first of the boat journeys in the Gospel of Mark, the calming of the storm at sea. We will briefly look at the exorcism of the demoniac at Gerasa. Then we shall turn to the central passage of the unit, the dual cure of the daughter of Jairus and the cure of the woman with a hemorrhage. These two cures place the faith of Jairus and the faith of the woman in direct opposition to the lack of faith found in the disciples in the boat scene. The entire section closes with Jesus' return to his hometown of Nazareth and his rejection there. After the parables, the crowd disperses and Jesus crosses the sea to the other side, Gentile territory. This narrative becomes a paradigm of the history of the early church. As the church moves from Jewish to a larger Gentile compositions, there are storms that arise. In the Gospel of Mark, there are a series of boat voyages from the western side of the Sea of Galilee, the Jewish side, to the eastern side, the Gentile side, and back. These occur between the end of chapter 4 in Mark and the beginning of chapter 8. The first voyage brings us into Jewish territory in 435 and terminates in Gentile territory at 5:1. This is the calming of the storm at sea. The return journey takes place at 5:21. A second journey to the Gentile regions takes place at 6:45 to 52. This text is known as the walking on water. The return is narrated in 6:53. After a slight journey north to Tyre and Sidon in 7:24 to 30, Jesus travels by way of the Sea of Galilee to the Decapolis in 7:31. The return from that journey is narrated in 8:10. The final journey by sea is narrated in 8:13. From the sea, they stop briefly at Bethsaida in 8:22 and travel north to Caesarea Philippi in 8:27 and return back through Galilee in 9:30. This final journey becomes the geographical locus of what is known as the central section of the Gospel of Mark. The text of the first journey begins giving the time and setting of the event. Evening is approaching, and Jesus wishes to cross to the other side. Now, if we look at this pictorial map, we see that the Sea of Galilee is rather small, 7 miles wide, 14 miles long to be exact. It is surrounded by hills of various heights, and so a wind blowing down those hills into the sea can cause quite an upheaval in the water, so strong storms were quite common. This final picture gives an idea of what it is to be on the Sea of Galilee in a boat. After the parables discourse, the disciples depart from the crowd. They take Jesus and embark on a journey to the other side of the Sea of Galilee via boat. This is the boat that Jesus had commanded to be prepared for him in chapter 3, verse 9. Now, there were other boats that joined them carrying those around him. Thus the scene is set. Mark tells us that a fierce windstorm arose on the Sea of Galilee. Some have described it as a tornado-style whirlwind. The wind was so strong that the waves were breaking over the boat. You can imagine the terror of the disciples traveling in a boat such as was found near Gennesaret. This raging storm did not seem to faze Jesus at all. He was asleep in the stern on a pillow. The disciples do the only thing that they know. They wake Jesus. They rouse Jesus. Again, there is an interesting connotation in the Greek. It is the verb egero, which, as I have mentioned, is used to describe the resurrection. Thus, they call Jesus back to life, back to involvement in their lives to save them. In their alarm, they say to Jesus, "Teacher," note the formal address, "is it not a care to you that we are perishing?" Put more plainly, do something now. We're going to die. Now, this is a rather unusual response for those who had just seen Jesus cure the sick, expel demons, etc. Surely he did not bring them this far to die in a storm. So Jesus does do something. He gets up, rebukes the wind, and commands the sea to be quiet and still. Now, the use of verbs here. Rebuke, epitimao, we noted was used with regards to the demonic in earlier parts of the gospel. The be quiet or still was used to the demons in the man who was possessed in the synagogue. Hence, the sea being in such turmoil is the work of the demonic. Jesus has power over demons, and so also power over the sea. He has bound yet another of the forces of evil that is in the world. The wind and the sea obey him, and there is great calm. The storm is over. It has ended at the command of Jesus. Jesus then turns to the disciples and scolds them. Why were they fearful? Now, given the circumstances, such fear, terror, etc., would seem to be perfectly natural. But Jesus expected something more of the disciples because of the time they have spent with him. Did they think that he would allow them to be destroyed? Obviously, he thought they did. And so, the second more significant question, have you no faith? The demand for faith has been at the forefront since the beginning of the gospel. Belief in the good news was a prime response to the inbreaking of the kingdom. Implicit in their call to follow was a call to be a people of faith. They're not living up to that. Turning to the disciples, Mark notes that they were filled with great awe at what has just happened. Literally, the Greek tells us they feared with a great fear. Now that means that they had a great, awesome reverence for the one who was on the boat with them. But they were still a bit fuzzy regarding exactly who he was. They say to each other, "Who is this, whom even the wind and the sea obey?" This is another question that clearly demonstrates their weak faith. Jesus is trying to strengthen it, but the disciples are somehow obstinate. They clearly do not know what we, as readers or hearers of the gospel, know. Think perhaps of an event in your life where God intervened in a significant way. Was the power of God evident? Did the event strengthen your faith, or did it cause you to question more? This is the situation the disciples are in now. As we continue to move through the gospel, we shall see them waver back and forth in faith. Many who have had much less experience of Jesus will demonstrate far deeper faith in him. For example, Jairus and the woman with a hemorrhage, whom we shall meet in the next section. The next text, the Gerasene demoniac, shows Jesus performing a rather spectacular exorcism of a man who has been an outcast because of his possession. It is a typical exorcism narrative such as we have seen earlier in the Gospel. The demoniac is introduced in a rather graphic manner in verses 1 to 5. Then there is an encounter with and a dialogue with the demons, culminating in the exorcism, verses 6 to 13. This is followed by the reaction of those who witnessed the exorcism, verses 14 to 17, and the narrative concludes with a note about the healed man, verses 18 to 20. Through Jesus' action, the man is brought back into society and begins to proclaim in his home region the wondrous deeds that God has performed for him. This demonstrates that the kingdom is not restricted to the Jew. It is also open to Gentiles who are willing to believe. This is a picture of modern Kursi, where it is traditionally held that the exorcism of the Gerasene demoniac took place. Note the hills down which the swine could run. The only problem is the sea today is about a mile away from the hill. The land has filled in over the centuries from what it was in Jesus' day. Either that or the pigs had to be rather strong-footed to run the mile down the hill and into the sea. Now we move to the narrative of the cure of the daughter of Jairus, coupled with the cure of the woman with a hemorrhage. This narrative again demonstrates the favorite Markan sandwich technique. The text concerning the synagogue official, Jairus' intervention with Jesus on behalf of his dying daughter, is interrupted by a narrative of Jesus curing a woman with a hemorrhage. Both cures pertain to someone who has been afflicted for 12 years. Both cures are performed on females. Both cures restore one to health. And finally, and most importantly, both cures demonstrate faith. The faith of Jairus and the faith of the woman, which stands in sharp contrast with the weak faith of the disciple. Jesus returns to the Galilean or Jewish side of the sea. The first sea voyage has been completed. A large crowd meets him, and he again begins to preach the word to them. That basically sets the scene. In the midst of the preaching, Jairus, a synagogue leader, also known as archysynagogos, who was the head or president of the synagogue, approaches and falls at Jesus' feet and pleads with him for his daughter. She's near death, and so he begs Jesus to come, lay his hands on her, that she might be saved and might live. Now, this would be seen as quite unusual, as Jairus, being a ranking member of the synagogue, would ostensibly be part of those opposing Jesus thus far in the gospel. Yet, despite any feelings of opposition, he feels that Jesus can do what no one else has been able to do: save his daughter's life. Jesus grants his request and departs with Jairus toward his home, accompanied by a large crowd who pressed in around Jesus, as the Greek verb synthlibo connotes. Imagining this picture of a large crowd pressing in on Jesus, his disciples, and Jairus is crucial to the next part of the narrative. In the midst of this crowd, on the way, there was another person seeking Jesus' help, a woman who suffered from a hemorrhage for 12 years. Such an ailment made her ritually unclean, and thus to a certain degree cut her off from society and religious practice. Further, Mark tells us that she suffered greatly under physicians' care, and all her resources were used up, presumably with doctor's bills. But all served to little avail. She was just as bad as she was 12 years ago, In fact, she continually became worse. So, in a sense, her plight is similar to that of the daughter of Jairus. She had heard about Jesus and is in the crowd and works her way toward Jesus. Finally, she is behind him, being jostled by the crowd. In position, she touches the hem of his garment. Note, her faith is so strong that she feels that a small gesture, such as touching his garment, will be enough to heal her. She says to herself, "If I touch the hem of his garment, I will be saved." Note the use of the verb save. It's the same verb used by Jairus in his request to cure his daughter. This is a manifestation of the belief that power is in the body of a holy person. It can be transferred through objects such as clothing. Such understanding was common in the ancient world. The result is immediate in typical Markan style. The bleeding stopped. She became aware, feeling that she was healed of her affliction. Immediately, you see how Mark uses the adverb to build the story. Jesus realizes that something had happened. Power had gone out from him. So he turns and asks the disciples, "Who touched me?" The disciples considered this question a bit much when there's a crowd jostling him back and forth. They answer in a somewhat sarcastic manner, "Don't you see the crowd pressing in upon you? How can you ask such a silly question?" They don't get it. Yet this does not deter Jesus. He continues to look around in the crowd, trying to determine who it was that touched him. But his task is made easier by the fact that the woman admits everything. She falls at his feet in fear and trembling and tells him the whole truth of what she has done and why. Through the use of the combination of verbs fear and trembling, Mark is letting the reader know that the woman senses that she is in the presence of the divine. The response to a manifestation of God is fear and trembling. Jesus' response acknowledges her faith. He addresses the woman as daughter, which establishes a familiar relationship. It will be remembered that at the end of chapter 3, the true familial relationship with Jesus was not through blood, but through faith. Your faith has saved you. Note again the use of the verb save. Not only has she been cured of her malady, she also has been given an opportunity to change her life through acceptance of Jesus and his message. That's the response that Jesus suggested to the inbreaking of the kingdom in chapter 1. Through this acceptance and through this faith, she is saved both on the physical, the cured hemorrhage, and the spiritual, commitment levels. This is expressed in the tenses of the verb save in each use above. The woman expresses a future wish, "I will be saved." Here that has been accomplished, expressed through the use of the perfect tense, "You have been saved." She is then dismissed with the words, "Go in peace." These words are the standard parting formula for good Jews. But if we take the deeper meaning of peace in the Hebrew sense, it can also be an invitation to move now into a deeper fullness of well-being that comes from belief in Christ. A final exhortation is given to the woman. Remain healed from your affliction. Jesus has hardly had a chance to finish speaking to the woman when the focus switches back to Jairus and his daughter. People come from Jairus' home to announce that it is too late. His daughter has died. Therefore, there is nothing more that Jesus can do. So don't trouble him any longer. Jesus overhears the message and says to Jairus, "Do not fear. Only believe. Just have faith." Perhaps Jairus is getting a bit anxious as Jesus is taking time to heal and speak with the woman. But such anxiety, Jesus affirms, is not necessary. The only necessity is faith. The present tense of the verb implies that Jairus is to keep on believing. It was an incipient faith that brought him to Jesus. Now he must continue acting on that same faith, even in the face of what seems impossible. There is a message for all of us in Jesus' words to Jairus. In times of difficulty and trial, our natural tendency is to worry, to be anxious, or to fear. Jesus tells us, as he told Jairus, that this is not the correct tendency. Rather, keep on believing. It is precisely in such times that the temptation to stop believing is the greatest. We cannot let that temptation take over. We need only to recall Isaiah's words to King Ahaz, "Unless your faith is firm, you shall not be firm." Isaiah 7:9. Jesus then enters the house, taking no one with him except Peter, James, and John. Upon entering, they encountered the typical commotion that accompanies the household of one who has died. People were weeping and wailing boldly and loudly. Jesus' response to the weeping and the wailing is to question why. Then he makes the extraordinary observation that the child is not dead, but only asleep. Now, many times one will speak of a dead person euphemistically as sleeping, but everyone knows that that's not the case. They've died. So the response to Jesus of the people in the house is outright laughter, ridiculing him. The ordinary Greek word, okay, we haven't had much Greek lately, for laugh is gilao, which is the second part of the word used. When prefaced by the preposition kata, it makes the verb emphatic. They laughed heartily. They really laughed. They had a good laugh, or they ridiculed him. This prompts Jesus to put the mourners out. Again, the Greek is telling. The same word is used for expelling demons, ekbalo. Then, taking Jairus and his wife and his 3 disciples, Jesus enters the room where Jairus' daughter lies. The answer to Jairus' original request comes when Jesus takes the child's hand and utters the words in Aramaic, Talitha kum, which means, "Little girl, arise." The word arise in Greek is the imperative of egero, which again is from the verb used to describe Jesus' resurrection. Thus, what happens to this little girl is a foreshadowing of what will happen to Jesus at the end of the gospel. The verification of the miracle comes when the girl, whom we are told is age 12, arose immediately and walked around. To complete the resurrection parallel, the Greek word for arose is also the word used to refer to Jesus' resurrection. But a side note here. We need to introduce the distinction between resuscitation and resurrection. Resuscitation is a bringing of a dead or a knocked out person back to life, but it's only life as we know it. They will die again. Here, Jairus' daughter is brought to life, resuscitated, but will die again. Resurrection is a bringing into eternal life, never to die again. This is won for us by Jesus through the cross at the end of the gospel. Thus, this resuscitation can be said to foreshadow the resurrection of Jesus. Back to the miracle. The people respond with utter astonishment. They are, as the Greek text says, ecstatic with great ecstasy. Not only has Jesus shown his power over demons, illness, and nature, now he shows power over death itself. It's a wonder that anyone would doubt him after this. But as we know, they do. Finally, Jesus gives strict orders that this is to be kept secret. This is another instance of what is known as the Markan messianic secret. Anything in the gospel that might be interpreted as Jesus being Messiah is hushed up. The reason being that the audience in the gospel and the audience hearing the gospel or reading the gospel might not interpret it correctly. Jesus will clearly and definitively describe what it means for him to be Messiah in the central section of the gospel, which we shall examine in a few more sessions. After that, the messianic secret disappears, and the messianic titles and Davidic titles break forth. But at the present point, it still must be kept secret. In this Markan sandwich, we meet two people of faith. One, a prominent leader of the Jews, the other, a rather lowly woman. Both see Jesus as one who can do great things for them. Because of this faith, Jesus does great things. This unit shows again Jesus' power over sickness, but now expands that power to encompass even death itself. These two stand in contrast to the disciples who are of little faith, and the family whom we will meet in the next unit who lack faith altogether. The final unit of this section is also the final unit of the second subsection of the first part of the gospel. It narrates the second rejection of Jesus. This time it's his family and relatives. They have already been portrayed in a somewhat bad light in chapter 3. Now they're seen as rejecting his ministry. The rejection of Jesus is getting closer and closer to home. The scene is set as Jesus departs from the home of Jairus and travels to his native place, his hometown of Nazareth. It should be noted that Mark does not make any mention of Bethlehem as the birthplace of Jesus. He only speaks of Nazareth as the place where Jesus, Mary, and Joseph lived. Now we know from Matthew's Gospel that after being forced to flee to Egypt because of a threat on the life of Jesus from King Herod, the Holy Family returned to settle not in Bethlehem, but rather Nazareth. Hence, Jesus in the Gospels is known as Jesus of Nazareth. His disciples follow him, and on the Sabbath, Jesus enters the synagogue at Nazareth to teach. The response to his teaching is further astonishment from those who are listening. Okay, here comes another Greek word. The word used for astonished is ekpleisonto, which is a compound form of, you guessed it, two other Greek words. Ek meaning from or out of, and pleso, which means to strike. In other words, the teaching of Jesus has struck or jarred them out of themselves. This has been the general response to Jesus' teaching from the general populace. They wonder where he came by such a manner of teaching. After all, he's only the son of their neighbor, Joseph the carpenter. Here we have a picture of the plaque that stands outside the synagogue at Nazareth today. It's inscribed in Hebrew, Arabic, and English, noting that this is the traditional spot where pilgrims and other worshippers came to pray at the spot where Jesus preached in Nazareth. As with many sites in the Holy Land, there is now a Catholic, actually a Greek Catholic, community worshiping nearby. Inside, you can see how the synagogue has been transformed into a church. The arch behind the wall was the niche for the Torah ark, and along the side walls were benches for the men who worshipped in the synagogue. The worshippers in the synagogue of Jesus' day ask, how does he come to such wisdom? and why mighty works are accomplished through his hands. They have heard of wondrous things that he has been doing in the surrounding area. But as is the case with many well-known people, those closest to him refuse to see anything extraordinary. The famous response, "We knew him when," for example, "he was a child in diapers," is their response. The congregation in Nazareth gives an equivalent to that in their question, "Isn't this the craftsman, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joses and Jude and Simon? He's simply an ordinary worker. How can he be the one who calms storms, cures illnesses, exorcises demons, and raises even the dead? Even his sisters are in our midst." Instead of amazement at what Jesus was accomplishing, the group in this synagogue at Nazareth are scandalized by him. The word derives from the noun skandalon, which is a stumbling block. Jesus is causing a stumbling block for them. So in English, we say they're scandalized. But that doesn't get at the total meaning of the verb. They had their own preconceived notions of who Jesus was based on their experience of his early days in Nazareth. And they cannot move beyond that to see him as a teacher sent by God or a worker of great wonders. Jesus' response to their reaction that no prophet is without honor except in three places: his hometown, among his relatives, and in his own house. We thus see that the negativity towards Jesus' ministry is spreading even into his family. The natives of his hometown seemingly expect the same treatment or even better treatment than the surrounding regions. But the reality is that Jesus is not able to do such in his own hometown. He can only cure a few sick people. The reason was their lack of faith. This astounded him. The people who knew him the longest could not come to faith. So all he could do was go to the surrounding villages and continue his teaching. Thus, at the beginning of this section, we see weak faith from the disciples, and at the end, we see the complete lack of faith on the townspeople of Nazareth. Both of these groups had greater knowledge of Jesus than most, yet they failed to come to an adequate faith. In the center, we have Jairus and the woman with a hemorrhage, who come to know Jesus from the word of others, and who demonstrate a strong, unshakable faith in him. They truly contrast with the disciples and the citizens of Nazareth. The positive and negative reactions to Jesus continue in the next section of the gospel, as Jesus feeds a crowd of more than 5,000 people and engages in strong debate with the Pharisees over the law.